Shabbat Shalom. In the Ben and Bat Torah class that we began this week, our congregant Stephen Tobolowsky made an observation about those great stories in the book of Genesis. And as something of a master storyteller, in fact, he's telling stories in Austin, Texas this weekend, he should know. And I agree, they are great stories, although perhaps not in the way that we might first think. Today I want us to take a look at the way the Torah tells one of those great stories, at the single arc of one woman's life. The name of that woman, or at least the name she was given at birth, is Sarai. And she arrived on the scene last week already married to Avram. Vesarai akara, says the Torah. It's the only thing it tells us about her at that stage. Sarai was barren. Ein la valad, says the Torah. She did not have a valad. She did not have a child. And that word valad is unique in the Torah. It only occurs here. And by it, I want to suggest that the Torah is drawing our attention to her, as indeed her name does. It means leader or princess. So what do we see on her first appearance? Someone who is noble on the outside and empty on the inside. A woman who is defined by what does not exist. This week, her husband is going to consign her to Pharaoh's harem, accumulating wealth on her behalf while she stays silent. What happened to her in there? The Torah doesn't tell us. Though our commentator, Ramban, is going to teach us that Avram's behavior to his wife in this episode is the real cause that our people were enslaved for 400 years in the land of Egypt. Like other pretty women who came after her, her beauty, which is remarked on by more than one man over the course of her story, is something of a curse rather than a blessing. Noble on the outside, pretty on the outside, empty on the inside, and still silent until halfway through today's Torah reading. And at the beginning of the Torah reading today, we heard her voice for the first time, and what she has to say is heartbreaking. Look, she says, God has kept me from bearing. Consort with my maid. Perhaps I shall have a son through her. The first thing we hear this woman say is that she's in the wrong. If she's barren, it must be because God is keeping her that way. She can only resort to birth at second hand in order to be built up, ibaneh, she says, as if she herself is a ruin. It would appear that the emptiness inside her has taken over the outside as well. How humiliating for her to admit this. How humiliating for her to fail. And she continues to fail. The handmaid becomes haughty, and she herself becomes irrational. And God does not answer her cry for justice. There's a dot over the word in the Torah to draw our attention to that. And Avram, that same Avram who next week is going to throw himself into a long discussion with God about what is right and what is wrong, Avram says, do what you like, darling. And she does. And we can only imagine her frustration and her pain as she watches it all unravel. Next week, we're told that she will have a child, although nobody thinks to share this idea with her personally. She learns of it while she lurks at the entrance of her own tent while her husband is entertaining. And perhaps her reaction, that bitter laugh, is not surprising. Oh, and by the way, her name gets changed. That happens this week. She's not told about that either. And the next thing, another harem. At least the owner of this one takes the trouble to compensate her. Here, says Avimelech, here are 1,000 pieces of silver for you, and you are clear before everyone. What happened to her in there? We don't know that either. And finally she conceives. Tzchok asali Elohim, she cries. God has made a fool out of me. Her bitter laughter has come back to haunt her. And 13 years later, that laughter will haunt her again when her stepson Ishmael is mitzachek, laughing and playing in a way that she finds unbearable. Both he and his mother must go, and she is left alone with the son she gave birth to and her husband until one day both of them go away on a trip. And she is not told of the trip, and she is not told of the destination, and the next thing we hear, she is dead. Each year I am struck more and more by the brutal honesty with which the Torah presents us with the contours of this Sarah's life, all 127 years of it. And it seems to me that it can't have been a happy life. It seems to me that, at least as the Torah tells it, what we have are long periods of misery and heartbreak, not only at the fact that others are fertile and she is not only flashbacks to her time in the harem, but her own loneliness and isolation. We never hear of her having a friend. Underneath it all, perhaps, a deep homesickness from the place where she was born and grew up, and the place she left behind. When she speaks, according to what the Torah tells us, she speaks with an acid edge. When she's silent, which is often, we may imagine her brooding. This is a woman whose name means nobility, who could have been a Deborah, or an Abigail, or a Huldah, except that in her time, women didn't do that. And perhaps some of us can remember women of previous generations who lived similar lives, who could have been CEOs and attorneys and executives had they not been born ahead of their time, just as I believe Sarah was. And like her, they were confined to home and making cake. It wasn't so long ago that women were being told, and I quote, "Don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house, and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him." It was only 29 years ago this week that women were admitted to the conservative rabbinate in this country. And as Ellen DeGeneres brilliantly observed this week, Bic is still making pens for women. Yes, in women's colors, pink and purple. Sarah's objectification, Sarah's frustration, the way the world defines her by her emptiness and the way that she is trivialized remain relevant. And this week we saw an ugly illustration of some of the worst aspects of Sarah's story in the events which took place at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. The Western Wall, as we know, is the last remaining part of the platform upon which the temple stood. And there we saw a clash between Anat Hoffman and her pressure group, Women of the Wall, and other people who believe that she does not have a place there. We're probably familiar by now with the background to the case. There's an Israeli Supreme Court decision dated 2003 that forbids women to read Torah, wear tefillin, or wear a talit at the kotel. They may wear a shawl, and many women have chosen to wear their talitot this way, even though this way is not the halachically correct way to wear a talit. When Anat Hoffman was arrested, she was carrying the Torah from the wall to Robinson's Arch, which is a place away from the Temple Mount where women are permitted to read from Torah. And I've tried, but I've not been able to find a copy of that 2003 court decision online, whether in Hebrew or in English. That could be as much to do with my difficulty in searching in Hebrew as to whether the decision is out there or not. It's unclear to me from what I have been able to read whether carrying a scroll without reading it is prohibited or not. And it's also unclear to me from the reports whether she was specifically arrested for something to do with the carrying of the Torah, or specifically arrested for something to do with the way she was wearing her shawl, or was she arrested for neither of those two things, but for the recitation of the words of the Shema out loud at the women's section of the wall? It's not clear. But whatever her alleged infringements may or may not have been, I was chilled to read her own account of the way that she was treated while in prison. And this is what she says. I was handcuffed, strip-searched, laid on the bare floor. I was not allowed to call my lawyer. I was dragged on the floor with my hands cuffed, and worst of all, locked in a tiny cell with a crying young Russian woman accused of prostitution, who was the target of every filthy comment male inmates could utter. Her tears and their words are the hardest memory for me to move on from. The frustration which drove her cry at the wall, the humiliation for having cried out, the trivialization of her body, the verbal abuse and the sheer brutality of that episode. When I read of Anat Hoffman that week, I felt deep unease at the similarities that I perceive between that story and what we read in the Torah in terms of the way that Sarah's story is told to us. Whatever the infringement, I consider that that treatment in prison was disproportionate for an offense that breached local custom, according to the 2003 decision. And most of all, I feel despair that it is still, apparently, even after all this time, impossible for a woman to be held acceptable in that place unless she is covered up and silent and content to be squeezed to one side like Sarah in the doorway of her tent. And it would appear that being ahead of one's time is still just as hard as it ever was. And this should not be happening. Unfortunately, it appears that there are many others, both here and in Israel, who also feel that it should not be happening. There are Orthodox men who stand close to the mechitza at the wall with their tefillin, holding on to the lattice when those women are praying there. There are rabbis who visit, who pray with women at the wall at Robinson's Arch. And my friend and colleague Ron Goldberg, who is currently spending his year in Jerusalem to study for the rabbinate, was there at the wall and wrote to me in an email, quote, "I can't pretend that I agree with everything Women of the Wall says or does, but I believe that we cannot sit by and see the Jewish faith being taken over by those who would lead us backwards in time. A Judaism that views half its population as inferior is not, in my humble opinion, what Hashem intended in the creation of woman. This backward step does not bring us closer to the divine. It does not bring kavod to the people of Israel, nor does it increase holiness. And I stood at the Kotel to show where I elect to stand." As we're going to hear after lunch from Dan Jacobson of the Masorti movement, welcome. Perhaps the great Jewish battle of our times is the one between Jewish fundamentalism and Jewish liberalism, between those who want Torah to stand still and those who see it as an evolving flow. And both of those camps contain, and both of those camps have always contained, both men and women. Always. From the earliest days of Judaism, as far back as the 2nd or 3rd century, we have anthologies of the words of rabbis, men, who were not prepared to accept that what the Torah tells us is all there was to Sarah, our ancestor. It is these men who gave us the tent of Sarah the matriarch open on all four sides. It is these men who gave us Sarah the prophetess. It is these men who explained that Sarah was protected in the harem by a personal angel who pushed away any part of the man who was trying to approach her, and many more stories about her besides. It was these men who refused to accept that the words of the Torah are finite and complete as they stand, and their stories breathe life into Sarah, using the words of the Torah itself, along with those of the prophets and the other writings, to prove that their conclusions are correct. Their methods are as brilliant as they are audacious. They are called darshanim, and their work is called midrash, the work of deep inquiry. And if I may borrow the words of another male rabbi, this enterprise also is Torah and speaks truth to us, and no less a teacher than Maimonides says that is the case. And so I turn to the midrash for a teaching to fit this current situation. Do you remember the first words that are used of Sarah? Ein la valad, it says. She has no child. Rabbi Levi, 2nd century, 3rd century, maybe, teaches, B'chol makom shene'amar ein la havala. When you see the words ein la used of a woman she did not have, it means that in the end, havala, she got. What was missing comes to be. Ein la valad is said of Sarah. V'havala, she gives birth to Isaac. Ein la banim is said of Hannah. V'havala, she gives birth to Samuel. And so, Rabbi Levi teaches that when Jeremiah says, Tzion hi doresh ein la, she is Zion, and nobody seeks her out, we know that a havala must be coming. A redeemer will come, he teaches, uva leTzion goel, and the one who was barren will sing out so loudly that she will almost explode with joy and triumph. Roni akara lo yalada, pitzchi rina v'tzahali. Rabbi Levi breaks open the emptiness that we heard in Sarah. He shows us that far from being akara, being barren, the space within her is a space that contains the potential for infinite joy. And now we need to follow his lead in regard to Zion, in that last example, for the Zion for whose welfare we ourselves pray. Doresh ein la, says the verse. There is nobody to seek her out, but also we can translate, there is nobody who will interpret her. But there is. She has seekers. She has interpreters. She has us. Havala doresh. Let her have interpreters. Let us stand with Rabbi Levi and the generations that came after him and hold tight to this idea of Havala. Let us continue to break open the brittle shackles of concepts like local custom that trap both men and women. Let us dare to envision a Zion which rings triumphantly with joyous song, a place where both men and women, honoring each other, respecting each other's place in the tradition, can live and pray in mutual respect. Havala, for Sarah's sake. Shabbat Shalom.